My name is Eric Linton. I am an artist. I've been a full-time artist for about 10 years. I most like to paint with oils. And today what I want to demonstrate is a very simple way to focus on values in a painting. And we're going to be using just one single color, burnt umber. Traditionally, it would be called a bruneille painting. It's used often for underpaintings. So it's a great way to establish your values and then add color later on. Or it's just a great way to focus on values, composition, and things like that without having to commit too much time to it. So I'm hoping to be able to do this in about an hour. And we're going to be doing a lot of reduction. It's kind of like an erasing method using some pretty simple tools. These are kind of, rubber-based tools that allow you to scrape and lift paint off of the surface. So basic tools, only one color of paint. It's a very simple approach. Great way to practice form, shapes, values. And I want everybody who's watching this to feel like you don't need to have a ton of materials to be able to get into painting. So if you're a beginner, this is for you. If you're advanced, I think this is also for you. It's a great way to practice basics, not have to spend a lot of money. Besides these really basic tools, I'll only be using probably a couple different brushes, and I'm working on just a piece of wood. I've put an acrylic paint cover on it as a gesso, and it's fairly smooth. It's going to be easy to just lift off with some of these tools, and I hope you enjoy it. All right, hope you guys are excited about this. I'm going to be painting a little sketch of my daughter today. It's kind of a chiaroscuro, so that means there's a lot of dark background in this with a few pops of highlights. And what I like to do with these sketches in burnt umber is I pretty much just cover my entire canvas in burnt umber to get started. So you don't need anything special for this. I'm using, I think it's a sable filbert brush. If you're not familiar, if you're kind of new at this, it's basically a finer hair brush, and filbert means it's got this kind of curve to it. But I don't want people to feel too overwhelmed, like you have to have exactly the right thing. You could pretty much use whatever you want to get paint on your canvas. And again, for my canvas, I'm using just a piece of plywood that I bought from Home Depot, and I painted it with white acrylic paint. And so it's kind of the fast and dirty way to get a great surface to paint on. And acrylic, I've found, works really well as a gesso, especially because it dries fast and it kind of gives you a nice smooth surface to be able to lift the paint off, like what we'll be doing a lot of today. So again, my goal today is to teach you guys how to do this quick form of sketching in oil. It can be used as an underpainting, can be a final finished sketch, but I want everybody to feel like this does not have to be an overwhelming process. It can be pretty simple. You can do it in a small room with limited materials and have a lot of fun doing it. It doesn't have to cost a lot of money. So if I'm talking about specific materials, it's just what I like to use, but there's so many different methods to do it. You don't have to buy, a sable brush to do this, but it's just some of the materials that I'm comfortable with, but definitely not a rule that you have to live by. All right, so this is a picture of my daughter looking out of her bedroom window. She's sitting on her bed, so we've got different fabrics that we're going to be painting. We've got a wide range of light, from the lightest light in the window to the darkest dark, which is, her shadow under her leg and pants. And so that's kind of what I like to look at in the very beginning. And so here's one of the tools I like to use from the beginning is, it's made by Catalyst. It's just kind of this flexible rubber material, and it's got these different wedges on it so you can get different sized shapes. And I'm thinking right now as I'm looking at this, what are the biggest shapes in this image? And obviously the biggest shapes are going to be the window, the wall, the bed, and the figure. So right now I'm focusing on the lightest large shape, and that's going to be the window. And I'm going to just basically block it out using this reduction method or erasing method. And there's our window, just as simple as that. And now I'm looking at where else do I want to create some highlight. I'm going to kind of ignore that pillow right there. Just focus on the light on those sheets. I'm going to keep her knee in mind right there. And just find those big shapes. Again, I'm looking at the lighter shapes right now. And I'll come back in, work on some additional detail, like the wrinkles in the sheets and things like that. But I'm not going to worry about detail yet. One of the things that has been a struggle for me over the years as I've been painting is to not get too caught up in detail. I grew up being super focused on trying to get every little bit of detail. And sometimes in drawing, that was nice. But then when I started to paint, I realized that the more you focus on little details like that, kind of the less emotion comes through. And I think that one of the biggest compliments you can give to the observer of a painting is to let them take part in the process of constructing a painting. It's kind of like poetry. If you read a poem where everything is spelled out and there's no nuance, there's no room for your own interpretation, typically you're not going to enjoy the poem very much because it's just so obvious it's not even worth saying. And I think painting often is the same way, that people want to take part in the creative process by not having every single detail pointed out to them. So they're allowed to look at something, and even subconsciously their brain's going to make sense of a few different spots of paint and be able to interpret it as, you know, a nose or a hand or something like that. And it's strange that those tend to be the paintings that people are most drawn to, where they're allowed to create, to take part in that creative process. Okay, so I've kind of focused on the basic shapes. Maybe what I'll do first is, so I'm looking at her overall figure, and she's a little bit darker than the background behind her. So I could either lighten up this background, which I'll probably eventually do. But right now I'm just gonna block out the figure. Again, in very large shapes. I'm looking at angles from, you know, for her forehead to her knee. So I'll probably want to go a little bit more like that. And put things in the background, kind of push it back a little bit. So I've got head there, shoulder there, coming down, and then coming down to the knee there. So you'll see a lot of this isn't going to seem to make sense right as I'm doing it, because you'll see me putting down paint, lifting off paint, sometimes even in the same places, and it's just a part of the process for me. I'm not feeling like things have to be exact from the beginning. And I'm also not overly committed to anything I put down until the very end. I want to be willing to deconstruct. And sometimes that's painful because there's things that I might really like in the painting, but if it's not working with everything else, I have to let it go. And I think that's a sign oftentimes of a good painter, because you'll see these paintings, and I'm sure everybody's kind of had this experience where they can tell that the artist was really proud of something and they left it in there even though it didn't work with everything else. And so I really try to not do that. Okay, so I'm using another tool for erasing now. So we use that larger one for these bigger shapes. I might still use a little bit, but now I'm going to move on to this smaller one. And it just gives me a little bit more control now to create more detailed highlights. And again, I'm not committing too much to anything yet, but getting an idea for where I want these highlights, where the figure needs to be. And so we're blocking in these forms in the light on her shirt, on her shoulder right here. We'll fine tune it a little bit later. Just starting from big shapes and working down to smaller shapes. And I'm wondering if the head maybe is going to be higher than I like. Let's see how it goes. It might work. So there's the forehead here. I'm going to just make a little mark for the nose and the upper lip. And there's the chin. Okay. Very basic still. Don't want to get too caught up in detail yet. And now work on the rest of the form. So here's her left shoulder. Maybe get a little more oil. For my solvent, I'm just using an odorless, what is it? So yeah, just an odorless mineral spirit. Try not to use it too much. It's just nice if I want to thin out the paint a little bit. And then sometimes I'll mix it in with some linseed oil. So everything that is on this surface right now is linseed oil, mineral spirits, and burnt umber. So very basic. All right, let's do her arm out here. There's her hand. And let's get her hip in there. So hopefully now you're kind of seeing the form taking shape. I think if somebody walked into the room right now, they'd still probably be wondering what the heck is going on here. It looks still fairly abstract, and it's probably good at this point. I'm also trying to paint. So I've got my setup here in my studio. My north light is on this side, and that just kind of helps with reflections. It's a little bit different right now doing this demonstration because I have this studio light, so hopefully you guys can see it clearly. But for me, I'm getting a lot of glare, and so I have to keep kind of turning my head a little bit further towards the camera. Okay, I think what I'll do now is I'm going to push back the value in the background right here on this wall. So I'm happy with the value here. I'll probably keep it about this light. But I want to feel like there's, so if you're thinking about what's actually happening in this room right now, light's coming through the window, and it's, most of the light that we see is hitting the other side of the figure, which means that it's also bouncing off that side of the figure onto the wall. And so we want there to feel like there's a little bit of light, refracted light off of the figure and back onto the wall. So I'm going to push that back a little bit. I'm going to raise the value. If you're not familiar with some of these words I'm using, I'll try and be conscious about it, because hopefully there's a wide range of people watching this demonstration, people who are more experienced and people who are less. So when I talk about values, really what I'm talking about is just the range of light to dark. So one of the things that I heard a lot as I was learning how to paint is the most important thing is not color. It's not even necessarily how good of a draftsman you are. It is how good you are at recognizing the values, the range of light to dark. And if you get your values right, the colors will start to just look right. Your brain can make sense of colors that are even different from maybe what it would be in reality, because primarily it's the values that we notice when we look at things. Colors change quite a bit. There's not one color for the green of grass or the blue in a sky. There's not one color of skin that makes sense to our eyes. But if the values on that are off, we will notice really quick. So even with something that, and even especially with something that's just in a single color like this burnt umber, your values are even more noticeable. And so that's why I kind of like to practice values in a single color like this sometimes, or in pencil or charcoal, because it really makes you focus on getting those values right. You're not distracted by color and some other things that we tend to emphasize. All right, so this background, you can see that just by lifting some of that paint off from my brush and wiping it on this paper towel, I've raised the value of that background. And I'll still play around with it a little bit more. It's definitely not finished, but it's helping me separate the value from the figure and the background. Okay, now even the value on her needs to be lifted a little bit too. So this is actually a good example. If you're looking at the photograph on the screen, my reference photo, you're going to see that the values, even the color actually, but the values between the background right here and her shoulder are almost the same. They basically blend together. So I don't want to, I guess, let my mind trick my eyes that, you know, there's this huge contrast. And again, that's one of the things that I think we subconsciously appreciate when we see an image, is when there's such subtlety that these lines start to disappear instead of everything being so clearly defined. But this is a bit of a, I think this is a challenge because there are such subtle value shifts. So the sketch is a bit of a challenge if you're sketching along. Don't be too hard on yourself if it's tricky to get those right. Okay, I'm gonna revisit some of these angles right now. Just as I was quickly sketching this leg, I realized, you know, this angle needs to be shifted upward quite a bit more. Her leg is foreshortened quite a bit. So it's probably a little bit more up and down than I thought. But we also have these wrinkles that come through the pants right there. So I'm gonna push that back in. There we go. Sometimes I even will just use a paper towel. It's one of the fun things about painting is, you know, for so long, people didn't have all these fancy tools. They just had kind of whatever was on hand. So in today's world, ends up being paper towels and Q-tips and things like that that end up being really useful tools. It's nice because they're cheap too. All right, so raise the value on that leg a little bit. I'll push it back because it's still a little bit brighter than what it should be, but now we've got that slight value shift from where her leg is, bare skin, and then the pants. Okay, now I'm gonna put some of these wrinkles in the sheets. And what's fun is I'm not going to focus on getting it right with my brush, because sometimes the eraser is the best way to get some of those sharp angled wrinkles. So that's when I like to get out something like this. Some really soft ones. Getting too caught up in the details of these sheets right now. So I'm gonna move on so I don't get too distracted. We'll revisit that. Okay, let's push the light coming through the other side here. And that's going to help us get the correct shape of the figure. So we're really defining that hip with the highlight on the sheets. And we'll also kind of show where that foot is. Okay. Now let's revisit the shadow on the left arm. I'm paying a little bit more attention now to my angles. And sometimes what I'll do is, you know, looking at my reference photo, I'll actually hold my brush up to the angle and compare it to what I have on the canvas. So like right now, holding it up to my reference photo. Yeah, it's about right. But there's just some simple tricks like that that can help when you're trying to figure out what's the right angle of an object. So I really love using these tools to erase. It's just such a quick way to get sharp lines and highlights. Okay. Bring some dark into this. So this is probably the darkest part of the painting right here. Darkest part of the reference photo. I'll come back and add some crisp highlights into that. But for now, I'm just gonna remind myself that that's the darkest spot. Just right here under the knee. It's also pretty dark right here on her hair. It's also very helpful when you're painting to take time to step back. I'm sure anybody who's painted a little bit, it can be shocking to take a break, walk out of the room, and then come back and see your painting with new eyes and realize I was way off with this or that. So I definitely encourage people to step back physically and look at it from 10, 15, 20 feet back, but also just take breaks, step out of the room, come back and see your painting with fresh eyes. And be willing to look at it critically, like I was saying. Don't be too attached to anything you've put down already, because I think a painter who's willing to be humble is most likely to make the best painting. All right, so I'm kind of using the sharp point now. I've been using the flat edge so far to kind of carve out these bigger wedges, and now, you know, as we're working from the bigger shapes down to the smaller shapes, I'm also changing from the bigger tools down to the finer tools. So let's really show where the light is hitting on the hair right here. The light's coming through the window. It's mostly hitting the far side of the body, but we're just getting this crest of light. It's coming right around the edge of the form and making these beautiful, finely detailed highlights right here. And this is going to be blockier than I want it to be, so I'll come back and revisit it with a brush and lay down some more darks. And that's the wonderful thing about oil paints too, is that you can just keep going over and over what you want to. It's very forgiving. So here's the contrast from those dark green pants, and we're adding just that rim light. From each one of those little wrinkles. And now we're letting the light side of the pants, letting the values of the pants and the sheets kind of blend together. Also trying to keep the form underneath the fabric in mind, to make it feel like it's kind of a rolling form. Try and lift off with the brush to get a more subtle change right there. There we go, that looks better. Same with her shirt here, just give the impression that there's some rolling forms in the fabric of the shirt. Again, this is where you really want to avoid trying to get exact details, because especially in the shadows, your brain can just make a lot of sense of that abstraction without having to add tons of detail. And that's kind of the poetry in the painting, is leaving those details to your brain. Feels like her belly's sticking out too much, so I'm going to kind of bring in the form of her shirt like that. Again, working from larger shapes to smaller. I'm looking for a brush that will give me those smaller, that can allow me to focus on those smaller shapes now that we're ready for that. Maybe I'll use this sharp edge. So I'm moving from a filbert to this flat. Let's establish the darks before I move on to the light. That's typically what you want to do with oil painting, is go from dark to light. Let's see if we can kind of work more subtle, beautiful shapes into the face. It's feeling very blocky right now. downside about erasing is it's a great way to separate your lights from your darks, but it doesn't give you a lot of control in how drastic those changes are. So it basically lifts almost all the paint off, so you have these more extreme highlights when really I don't want them to be that extreme, so I'm gonna have to go back in and push those back a little bit. So at this point I'm kind of just using it as a guide for where these separations need to take place. I'm getting the light on the cheek there, just leaving the nose in the shadow. It's also a little bit tricky when you're working this small. You especially don't want to get too focused on details. When it's a larger painting, you have more room for focusing on some of those things, but when it's smaller like this, you just want to give intimations of different things. Just an intimation that there's a nose there, or that that's where the lips are. Pushing those highlights back down. I'll come back and just add only a few highlights where it's really bright. So one of the things that I always like to look for in shadows is what we call the terminator, and it's a term that's also used in astronomy, where if you have an object like a sphere and then a light source and then something maybe behind it. So in the case of the Earth, it'd be the moon, or in the case of this reference photo, something else in the room where the light's coming through the window, bouncing off maybe the wall that would be behind us as the viewer, bouncing back onto her form. Is you'd see this darkest line right here on her face, and then it starts to come back to the light here. And so that terminator line in the shadow, that darkest spot is going to be right here. That's our terminator line. And so it starts looking a lot more three-dimensional when you just slightly raise the values just enough to show that there's a terminator line right there. And suddenly this face that was just fairly flat starts to feel much more rounded. We've got an ear right here that's going to really help us fill in this blank shape. That's probably all I'll do for the ear. It's just a really subtle smudge. It's a little bit lighter, catching just a little bit more light. I'm gonna lift off just a little bit here, showing the back of her neck. And we'll come back in with some dark again to really distinguish, to separate the hair from everything else, because the hair is quite a bit darker. Right now, if you look at the collar, that's catching quite a bit of light. So let's start separating the collar now. And we'll want it to be, with fabric, a lot of times, I love fabric because you have so many different transitions where you get sharp transitions where there's maybe a really crisp fold, or there's a piece of fabric that comes over like a collar above the rest of the shirt. And so right now I'm lightening it up, and then I'll come back with a really crisp line to separate the collar from the shirt. And then here, where you have these gradual folds, you don't want those crisp lines. You want things to be gradually blending together. So I'm just looking for all the spots where, as I was laying in those bigger shapes, I wasn't yet focusing on the value. And so they might be too dark or too light. Right now I'm looking for the spots that are too dark and pushing that value higher again. That's really so much of what you're doing as you're painting. You're putting things down and revisiting. And always being willing to give up on something and redo something that you've put down before. Talking earlier about how that shoulder's just going to start blending in to that value of the wall. Also that arm right here, this side of the arm really starts to blend in right where the shoulder is, where you don't have nearly as much of a value shift. So they start coming together, but your brain, it still makes sense because there's certain spots where the arm is being distinguished from the background. And even just this whole side right here. But down by the wrist, there's more of a strong shift in values. But up here, it's definitely lighter, and so you want to have those edges blend together a little bit more. And then once it comes, we work our way down to the hand, we start getting light hitting the top surface of the hand again, so we raise those values. Okay. All right, let's go back to revisit the darks. We talked about distinguishing that collar a little bit. So let's just add a few spots. Kind of tell our brain this is a distinct shape. You don't have to, again, spell it out extremely clearly. You just a few little spots is enough to help our brain understand what's what. Go in and define some of these folds in the fabric. Let's put a little bit more shade on the braid here. And we'll come back and add a few more highlights on the hair. Sometimes it's funny too, where what our eyes focus on. And I just realized that she's got a bow on her hair, and I hadn't even noticed that. Sometimes that'll happen when I'm drawing a figure who has tattoos. And I've done entire paintings where I haven't noticed the tattoo until I'm done and the figure's standing up, and then I realize that their body was covered with tattoos, but I was so caught up in the form, I didn't notice it. Also, it's a part of the creative process where we could choose to put things in or take things out, depending on what we're wanting the painting to be like. So we're going to add a little bit of this light that's catching the hair. There's quite a bit more light catching this whole shoulder and the hair over here than I realized. And the collar right here. Let's revisit this fabric and try and get that fabric to feel a little bit more like wrinkles catching the light. here, top of the head. This is probably the lightest spot. Right there, there's a good highlight right where her forehead meets her hair. Might need to blend that a little bit with a brush. Hopefully from this little demonstration, I've been able to learn a little bit about the importance of value and just the creative process where working from larger shapes down to smaller shapes, and a little bit about the form and shadows on the form and light and reflected light. Hopefully that helps to start noticing things. And I would encourage you guys, not just when you're painting, but when you're going about your everyday things, look for these types of things as you're driving in your car or on a bus. Try and see if you can notice around you the way that lights are hitting things, and does it have this rim light? Is there reflected light that's creating a terminator? All those kinds of things. And once you start looking for it, you'll start seeing it everywhere. Right, maybe last would be just adding some of these wrinkles into the sheets. Kind of already put in some of the more drastic wrinkles, and now we'll focus on some of the more subtle ones, just to make it feel like it's a bed and she's sinking down into the soft surface. It can be a little bit tricky. If you noticed a little bit of red sneak in, it's because I had some cadmium red paint on my palette and it has found its way into my burnt umber. So a lot of the times I'll do these little paintings before I do a final piece of work, where first I want to see if I like the layout. Before I commit on something that's going to be taking a lot of time, this is a great little study, a way to do a quick study. And sometimes I like to just have finished pieces that are just in burnt umber like this, because I think it has such a nice classical look. And so on some of my walls in my studio, I just have these little studies that I've done in burnt umber, and I love to look at them, and it helps me keep in mind some of the more simple things, almost like you would do, like if you were a basketball player, you always want to go back and focus on some of the basics like dribbling skills and stuff like that. When you're a painter, I think it's good to always go back and revisit the basics. And I had a family member once who's an artist who was saying that she didn't want to take a beginner art course because she felt like she was too good for it. And I said, well, I might challenge you on that, because I would love to take that beginner course just to remind myself of some of these basic principles that sometimes you forget, and it only makes you better by revisiting them every once in a while. And so I always like to take the approach that when I walk into a classroom or somewhere where learning is taking place, I try and remind myself to be pretty humble about it, and allow myself to learn something new. And so for me, these little sketches are one of the ways that I do that and build on some of my fundamental skills. All right, so hopefully that was helpful to look at. Now, if I was doing this as an underpainting for a painting that I wanted to work on long term, at this point, I would start adding some color. And that's a really fun part of the process. And maybe in the next few lessons, we will take an underpainting like this and add on to it and make it a finished painting.